like an hour away.
I want to welcome everyone.
Oh, yeah? Yes, it's one of the most popular in the world. Oh my gosh.
You're on there, Phil. Yeah. Okay, I want to welcome you all this evening. As you're getting situated, please continue eating. I'm sorry. I'm Sally McWilliams. I'm Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our third annual Walk of the Heroines lecture. One of our majors walked up to me and said, "What is the Walk of the Heroines?" And I'm delighted to be able to tell you it's kind of a multifaceted project. It's a literal space on campus. How many of you do your homework over there or just hang out when it's sunny? Oh, you need to get out more. So over by the football field, the soccer field, is a lovely garden, and that is the Walk of the Heroines. And you'll see there that there's a wall that has many thousands of women's names. And those names, behind those names, are all of the loved ones who have donated to have their heroine's name engraved on this space that we can all share in. And then there is the garden. So if any of you are interested in doing some gardening this summer, we'll be sending out emails to see if you want to come and help. Part of the process with the garden was that it would be a dynamic space. It wouldn't be static. And so in that regard, we need some human labor to get in there and pull some weeds, and we'll be doing some new planting as well. So you have those two aspects of the garden, and then and the walk. And then we have a curricular piece, which is the Monumental Women's Capstone, that is guided by Jan Dilge. Dan, thank you, Jan. She's a feminist historian, and this capstone runs every winter term and helps to build out the biographies that are on the Walk of the Heroines website. It's also an opportunity to really kind of dig deeply into the impact of gender and race here in Portland, and so some walking tours were created by a couple of capstones. So it's really a very dynamic space to engage with not only the names on the walk, but kind of the feminist history of Portland and the metro area. So that's an exciting part. And then we also have scholarships. So if you're in the Women's Studies program, we always have 3 or 4 scholarships every year that are thanks to the donors for the Walk of the Heroines. And then we have our annual lecture. So I want to thank some people who have helped to make this event possible. One of them is Kari Smith, who does all the logistical work. We want to give her a big shout out. And her able assistant, Margaret Rains, who is our student worker in the office, has also stepped up to help. Marlene was here to do some work behind the scenes. I want to call her out. And I also want to just take a moment to think about the people behind all of the names on the walk. So the donors, but behind all the donors were the women who really had this idea to have a space in Portland, which is actually not only significant in Portland, but nationally. There is no other space that does the same kind of work that the Walk of the Heroines does here on our campus. And so those women who came together to have this idea, Johanna Brenner, Jan Hawken, Sherwin Davidson, all alumni and professors here at Portland State. And then they had a board. And I want to just speak briefly about one of the members of that board, and that's Rosalind Farrington. We lost Rosalind in September, and yet having lost her, we still think about her and her impact on our department, on the work that we do, on the building of a beloved community here at Portland State. And I just wanted to acknowledge the work that she did in having kind of pulled together some ideas around what it would mean to have a space dedicated to women who are significant in people's lives. So I just want to thank her and all the work that she's helped us kind of engender in our work here at Portland State. And I know that she would be thrilled to have Breeze Harper here doing work on critical race feminism. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Wiesel, who's an associate professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and has done an amazing amount of work, as some of you know, because I know a lot of her students are here, around food justice, gender, and race issues. So Lisa.
honor and a pleasure for me tonight to welcome Dr. Amy Breeze Harper here, because I think at a talk that's titled The Walk of the Heroines, she's definitely a heroine of mine in terms of the work that she's done and cultivated around critical race and feminist food justice. So Dr. Harper's academic background includes a BA from Dartmouth College, an MA in Educational Technologies from Harvard, and a PhD from UC Davis in Critical Geographies of Race and Food. Her dissertation was titled Vegan Consciousness and the Commodity Chain. She's currently a research fellow at Food First in Oakland, California, working on the Dismantling Racism in the Food System Initiative. Breeze is the founder and director of the Sista Vegan Project. She runs a very extensive and illuminating blog. She puts on an annual conference, which we just finished up a couple of weeks ago. This year's theme was the vegan praxis of Black Lives Matter, and we were lucky enough to be able to have the students in the Race, Gender, and Food Justice class participate in that online conference here. So thank you very much for all the wonderful work, and I'm sure it took a lot of effort to put on that online conference, but it worked extremely smoothly and enabled all of us to get those perspectives that otherwise we might not be able to hear. So out of the Sista Vegan Project came the Sista Vegan Anthology, Black Female Vegans Speak on Food, Identity, Health, and Society, that was published by Lantern Books in 2010. This anthology is an important counter to the hegemonic neoliberal white constructions of veganism and the alternative food movement. And importantly, it created the space to bring together the multiple, complex, and intersectional voices of Black female vegans that in the diversity of their standpoints illustrate, in the words of Audre Lorde, that, quote, Black women are not one great vat of homogenized chocolate milk. Or in this case, that would be chocolate soy milk. So, and that's from Audre Lorde's essay, I'm Your Sister, Black Women in Organizing Across Sexualities. So Dr. Harper has a new project titled G's Up, Hose Down, Black Masculinity, Veganism, and Ethical Consumption, the Remix, which will explore how certain key Black male vegans are employing hip-hop methods to create race-conscious and decolonial approaches to vegan activism. She's currently running a crowdfunding campaign for this important book project, and you can see that on the Sista Vegan blog. In addition to all of this, Breeze has also authored a novel, Scars, a black lesbian experience in rural white New England, which uses the form of social fiction to convey themes of whiteness, racism, and breaking past boundaries of heterosexuality in critical race, Black feminist, and critical whiteness studies. So I think we're going to hear more about that tonight, but put that on your summer reading list. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Harper. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come to speak. I got here, my daughter and I arrived here yesterday, and maybe some of you heard her screaming as she realized that she wouldn't see me for approximately 90 minutes. But she's 18 months old, and I just give a fair warning that we've had something, a stomach virus or something, for the past 2 days. And it started when we left I guess we were at the airport yesterday, and I'm a little drained. So, and if you want to shake my hand, I don't want to give you what I may have, so I'll just bow to you. That's okay. So, you already introduced me, so I'll skip that part, which I was going to do. And I want to kind of jump into what I'm doing. So, I started the Sista Vegan Project to explore how Black female vegans in the USA practice veganism. And I wanted to actually say this is very important because of my cisgender woman privilege. The title of the book has become problematic, and I have to learn. I'm still learning about gender and sexual identification and gender minorities. So I've been asked to consider retitling it because it's very cis-sexist, and that was not my intention, but I don't actually want to focus too much on that, but let people know for the next project my intention will be to actually be more aware of that, of my cisgender privilege and how it shaped how I went about getting the anthology work. So I didn't realize female was a cis-sexist label. When I didn't invite people to give a contribution to the book, I made it clear that anyone who identifies as a woman, but putting female on there became problematic. And I'm learning. 8 years later, and I learned to be more inclusive in my language and understand how I may contribute to transphobia and cissexism. So with that said, the Sister Vegan Project, it's not really about veganism. For me, it's actually about how vegan objects and food items can tell us how systemic racism, globalized capitalism, and sexism shape how we arrive to our food philosophies in the white settler nation of the USA. So this evening, the title of my talk is Recipes for Racial Tension Headaches, a Critical Race Vegan Journey. I actually put this title together in reference to the physical and emotional stress that a lot of Black women feel living in a white settler nation. The constant everyday racial microaggressions, even from liberal whites, who claim they are quote-unquote not racist. During this talk, I wanted to talk about my recipes for such racial tension headaches, for the many physical and emotional elements that have resulted out of this continuum of living in and fighting against systemic racism and neoliberal whiteness, which I'll define later. My recipes to help remedy and understand the complexities of systemic racism are through the methodology of critical race materialism and within the discipline of critical studies of food. So what is this critical race materialism? It's influenced by critical race theory. Critical race materialism asserts that formal imperialism and legalized racism were replaced with racial neoliberalism at the end of the 20th century. Critical race materialism argues that racism was not eradicated, but in fact reconfigured in a way that fits the material and political investments of the global north, mostly white population. This arrangement is called coloniality, and mainstream ethical consumption rhetoric is not exempt from this arrangement. And I've named this arrangement as being part of neoliberal whiteness. So what is ethical consumption? Ethical consumption, oops, wrong slide, is a way to consume within a capitalist economy that is ethical. There's not really a concrete definition, but the ethical consumption movement has risen out of the wealthier nations for consumers to take accountability of how the consumer's practices can create less injustice and environmental damage. From making sure coffee is fair trade, to buying eggs that are from cage-free chickens, to buying food made from solar-powered companies, ethical consumers believe that capitalism consumption can create a just world if done ethically. So what are my central questions in the overall work that I do? How is ethical consumption articulated through the medium of edible products such as foods, herbs, and beverages? What can vegan objects such as food, books, beverages tell us about concepts of ethical consumption and their connections to the lived experience of race, i.e. anti-racism, racial privilege, colorism, normative whiteness? What is neoliberal whiteness and how are ethical consumption philosophies affected by it? So why food studies? In the Western Academy, the first food studies scholars were anthropologists who looked at exotic foods of non-white cultures in order to explain the cultural patterns of primitive peoples. Let me put that in quotes. Cultural food studies as a formal field of study was not established until the 1960s. Much of the analysis within cultural food studies is undergirded by the notion that tastes are not objective, but rather are social constructions which are culturally formed. Food reflects power structures and social formations. Food reflects power structures and social formations. I already read that, sorry. Influential theorists in this canon were Mary Douglas, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Pierre Bourdieu, and Roland Barthes. In her highly acclaimed Purity and Danger, Douglas analyzes the taboos around food that can be found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. She concluded that proper food protocols were a method for tribal societies to maintain their separate identity. This pattern still exists today. Lévi-Strauss explained that when one prepares food, they are in fact communicating a cultural identity which is repeated and solidified through repetition of culinary traditions. In the 1960s, he argued that food preparation was a form of socialization for society, and that the preparer of foods works as a cultural translator of cultural standards. Such cultural standards are significantly influenced by middle to upper class value systems and the meanings they give to culinary items. The underlying theme that appears to connect this food studies scholarship is the significant role that proper food philosophies play in the creation of not just purity, but how one expresses their sense of ethics. Whether it is raw, cooked, food prepared under the law of Islam, or cuisine that adheres to rules from biblical scripture, these all represent how people desire to literally consume to create ethical bodies, which in turn create ethical minds and actions. Such ethical inscriptions applied to food can be analyzed through food semiology. Semiology is the study of signs and seeks to understand how signs communicate the value system of a culture. For example, how are vegan food objects symbolized to create myths about innate purity, cruelty-free, and ethical? How are the signs of food ethics perceived, and how can such interrogations reveal how phenomena such as racism, neoliberalism, and globalized capitalism are normalized or rejected? Roland Barthes' scholarship on semiology has been used extensively in food studies, as well as critical whiteness studies, to analyze how modern objects convey a situation, how they reflect a system of communication, and most importantly, how the meanings inscribed on these objects literally shape the collective consciousness of modern Western society. The social places that certain foods have in society also display a particular type of attitude. For example, my fiction and nonfiction writing have explored differing attitudes that people have towards sugar, cocoa, even PETA-approved vegan food objects, animal products, fast food objects such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola. For example, food justice groups such as the Food Empowerment Project signify chocolate sweets with slavery and exploitation, while groups like PETA market big corporate vegan cocoa products as cruelty-free, simply because a non-human animal wasn't harmed, regardless if it came from enslaved child labor. Though Barthes is known for his work on semiotics of objects, his scholarship not only focuses on the object of food, but also on the objects of post-empire whiteness. In the mid-20th century, Barthes analyzed the effects of post-empire whiteness on the collective consciousness of white people living in the global north. His observations led him to believe that despite colonialism having been formally abolished, most white people will continue to function in the world through the logic and grammar of post-empire whiteness, which could be revealed through analysis of their relationship with and to everyday objects. I renew and extend this research by showing how organizations such as PETA in my dissertation work inscribes cruelty-free meanings on vegan food objects while obscuring the role that neoliberal whiteness plays to make these commodities possible, such as NAFTA. And I think that neoliberal whiteness is a form of post-empire whiteness. And what do I mean by whiteness? Let's just do this really quickly. So, the conscious or unconscious promotion and advancement of beliefs, practices, values, and ideals of Euro-American white culture, especially when those cultural values are represented as normal. Whiteness is a contemporary value system is formed by heteronormativity, neoliberalism, ableism, Christianity, consumer capitalism, cissexism, patriarchy, and middle to upper class sensibilities. And there is this misbelief that real racists are Nazis or KKK members. And there's this belief that overall racism is not an impediment to opportunity and equality. So that's just really important background for you to have. So Barthes' work has also inspired me to not only look at post-empire objects of neoliberal whiteness, but also analyze how the same vegan food objects take on contrasting and similar meanings that they do. So what I did for my dissertation work was show how white-dominated organizations like PETA, run by Ingrid Newkirk, have this post-racial, post-human take on what is racism. For people who aren't familiar with PETA, Ingrid Newkirk basically always says we're all animals, so get over it whenever anyone says that racism is an issue with PETA. So she has that perspective, and that she's used Trayvon Martin's case for their newest campaign to show that what happened to him was real racist, to kind of disconnect herself from those real racists, even though she is basically in collusion with neoliberal whiteness. So, and I looked at that for my dissertation work. So it's really important for me to give you this information because on the book Scars, I actually focus a lot on PETA and a character named Eric, who basically maintains neoliberal whiteness in a way that he's oblivious to. My analysis of food objects such as sugar, dairy, and cocoa, later seen in my reading of Scars, is not really about animal rights or even veganism. What my analysis will suggest is that mainstream framing of what are civilized and cruelty-free is linked to a larger American cultural phenomenon. Beneficiaries of neoliberal capitalist economy do not really want to know from where and how commodities get to them. The process of estrangement erases the genealogy of how these objects arrived there and how they took on the harmless meaning that they have, i.e. cruelty-free. Hence, estrangement teaches the holder of such objects that what they have in their hands is pure and innocent, that they have no responsibility to investigate any further how it got there in the first place. And such ideologies fool the subscriber of neoliberal whiteness into thinking they have active consciousness, when in fact this estrangement encourages passivity in consciousness. And this is exacerbated by the neoliberal politics of a post-racial USA, as I mentioned before. So let me just briefly explain the dominant themes in the vegan mainstream culture and dominant groups such as PETA before I move on to reading the book. So vegan food and healthy eating themes in the mainstream. Post-racial, race is no longer a significant impediment to creating equality, happiness, health. Bringing up race in any form actually means you're racist. So when I first proposed the Sister Vegan Project, I got lots of white liberals actually yelling at me that I'm racist for proposing that race affects how you come to your vegan praxis. Good times. So that actually became the basis of my master's thesis work. Look how covert whiteness operates in a I'm not racist vegan website. So I just looked at 80 pages of racist banter that a lot of people really thought was not racist at all, because the real racists are Nazis and KKK members. So instead of getting annoyed, I'll just write a thesis about it. So, and it did really well. I got the Dean's Award for it. So I guess Harvard thought I knew what I was talking about, while they didn't. People on the site didn't really know what they were talking about. So the vegan themes are that white, young, able-bodied, upper middle class, heteronormative, and thin bodies are the benchmark of healthy, moral, and green living. Veganism should only be about animal compassion and individual health. So once again, when I proposed, veganism as a way to explore anti-racism, I got a lot of mostly white vegans saying that's impossible, there's no connection. And I got that same response when I put together the vegan praxis of Black Lives Matter. Like they could not see the intersectional connection. So I basically was like, the redux of 10 years ago when I was working on my master's thesis, is that I was racist for bringing that up. But whatever, I put it together anyway at the conference, and it went really well. So another theme is that silenced are the realities of people of color that cannot be post-racial, as well as how being low income affects the ease of going vegan and engaging in other mainstream ethical consumption practices. And one of the underlying themes in the mainstream rhetoric is neoliberalism. And that means they think change can only really come through individual consumer power versus making structural change. All you need to do is buy vegan products to create a healthy body. Left out are issues such as racialized state violence, food deserts, and poverty that prevent marginalized populations from getting to the point where they can have consumer power, privilege, and choice. So the whole concept of voting or voting for your dollars or even voting at all is still very much racialized. And a lot of people, if you've ever read the New Jim Crow, you'll start understanding the consequences of massively incarcerating a huge portion of brown and black men, and what that means once you get out of jail, all of the rights you do not have. So, and that includes, your right to actually have food and healthy living, and voting for who you want to be in office, voting for who you want to see not screw over your community. There's a lovely book again. And Scars. So I wrote the social fiction novel Scars, A Black Lesbian Experience in Rural White New England, which was published in 2014. My book uses ethical consumption, food, and food objects as a way to confront the collateral damage of neoliberal whiteness. And I'll be reading excerpts from that book and then give my analysis of how one can actually use the book in terms of critical race materialism and food studies. You can use the book for many other different things, but I'm really focused on that today. So what's Scars about? First of all, it took me 12 years to write. It's more like just rewriting. Then in 2008, I was like, okay, I'm done. So I finished it. But I started in 1996 in Dartmouth College. It was kind of an offshoot of my Dartmouth College thesis about how it sucks to be bisexual or any other queer identification in rural white Dartmouth. So I'm like, why don't I just write a thesis about it, because no one's writing about it, no one's actually looking at whiteness at Dartmouth, so let me just do that. Instead of using my geography major, which most people did, largely white, to go outside to the developing world and try to solve problems there before actually looking at the problem of whiteness at Dartmouth. So I did that. So Scars is a novel about whiteness, racism, and breaking past the normative boundaries of heterosexuality experienced through 18-year-old Savannah Penelope Sales. Savannah is a black girl born and raised in a white working class and rural New England town. She is in denial of her lesbian sexuality, harbors internalized racism about her body, and is ashamed of being poor. She lives with her ailing mother, whose emphysema is a symptom of a mysterious past of suffering and sacrifice that Savannah is not privy to. When Savannah takes her first trip to a major metropolitan city for 2 days, she never imagines how it will affect her return back home to her mother or to herself, and her capacity to not only love herself, but also those she thought were her enemies. Scars is about the journey of friends and family who love Savannah and try to help her heal, all while they too battle their own wounds and scars of being part of multiple systems of oppression and power. Ultimately, Scars makes visible the psychological trauma and scarring that legacies of colonialism have caused to both the descendants of the colonized and the colonizer, and the potential for healing and reconciliation for everyone willing to embark on the journey. First character. Davis Allen is one of Savannah's best friends. And I'm giving you all this because you don't have time to read the whole book once I go into the excerpts. So I'm just giving you a short version of everything you need to know. Davis Allen is one of Savannah's best friends. A straight white male who grew up on a rural dairy farm in Savannah's hometown, Davis and Savannah have been close friends since they were toddlers. Davis is the only white friend Savannah has ever chosen to develop a close relationship with. When Davis and Savannah interact with each other, the intimacies of their conversations reveal an interesting dynamic. Davis's perception of reality manifests from what Savannah has marked as a privileged point of entry: white, male, lower middle class, straight, able-bodied. Davis can never experience Savannah's embodied experience as a black lesbian. Growing up in a country that has institutionally legitimized whiteness and heterosexuality as normal, Davis's white and straight identity limits him to superficially interpreting Savannah's verbal hostility as nothing more than stereotypical quote-unquote angry black woman banter. The second theme developed in Scars is the irreconcilable differences that Eric Roberts and Savannah endure in their rocky new platonic relationship. Eric and Savannah both identify as same gender loving, gay and lesbian. However, that is where similarities between them end. Their frequent antagonistic verbal intercourses deconstruct the common myth that being gay or lesbian means they will instantly connect emotionally to each other as comrades in the same battle against heterosexism. The exhaustive energy it takes for both to maintain their volatile relationship has its roots in Eric's oblivion to the fusion of his upper middle class status and his white man privilege when attempting to advise Savannah about being and coming out as a black, poor, and rural lesbian. The third and more subtle theme developed in Scars centers on how Savannah's perception of oppression is positioned within a geopolitically global northern perspective. Savannah never acknowledges her privilege as a U.S. national, only her lack of privileges as a non-white person. She considers herself revolutionary in thought in comparison to the people living in the provincial town she grew up in. Simultaneously, she has no awareness of her perpetuation of inequality outside of the USA. For example, Savannah is unaware of how many people of color outside of the USA are exploited so that she can buy cheap coffee, chocolate, and Coca-Cola. Esperanza Perez, a key character, is one of her best friends. Esperanza, a vegan and fair trade anti-globalization activist who originally grew up in Guatemala, visits Savannah from college. Through honest and heartfelt dialogues with Esperanza, Savannah's oblivious understanding of her geopolitical northern privilege is revealed. I hope to engage the reader to empathize with Savannah's realistic struggles with whiteness as the invisible norm, while also addressing the need for Savannah to engage deeper into social justice by encompassing and linking black struggles and USA racism to a broader range of social and ecological inequalities throughout the world, including the suffering and pain that go into commodities such as cocoa and the McDonald's pork sausage or chicken meals that come to Savannah's plate. My choice to title the book Scars reflects the legacy of black anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon and his intense dedication to making visible the psychological trauma and scarring that colonialism, white supremacy, and racism have caused to both the colonizer and the colonized. And my writing was really influenced by Octavia Butler and Angela Davis, not just in terms of black critical thinking, but also critical thinking along the lines of how much suffering non-human animals endure due to the oblivion of complex characters such as Savannah Sales. During a 2012 February visit to the University of California, Davis, Dr. Angela Davis, brilliantly shared her views on state-sanctioned violence by looking at how both people and non-human animals suffer, and she is a vegan. Core to Dr. Davis's analysis is the dangers of how so many of our minds have been colonized by capitalism to the point that we don't even think about how much suffering goes into a standard American chicken meal. So, thank you for, going through that with me. I just want to give you a lot of context so you know what I'm reading. So let me share some excerpts from the book and then dive into analysis of how I'm using these food and vegan objects to understand racial power dynamics and other dynamics in America and beyond. So the I character is the protagonist, Savannah. Quote, "Sitting at Eric's kitchen table, I stare at my Belgian waffle, wondering where my dress is, wondering whether I puked on it, wondering if, after talking to Mama on the phone, she really doesn't need me back anytime soon. 'Enjoy your free time, baby. Don't you worry about me,' she had told me. Enjoy my free time? I have begun to suspect that I don't know how to enjoy my free time. Had Eric been right? Do I really like to be miserable? Oh, what does he know? Nothing, because he's never been poor. Why would anyone enjoy being miserable? And then her friend Davis interrupts. Savannah, you've been staring at that waffle for the last 5 minutes. Without looking up, I shrug and reply. Lifting up my fork, I poke at it several times, sniff, and then put my fork back down. I don't enjoy being miserable. I slouch down into the brushed stainless steel dining chair. Who buys stainless steel chairs for a dining table anyway? My toes grace the warm hardwood floor of the dining room. On the left of me is the entrance to Eric's kitchen. Ceiling track lights brightly illuminate a newly renovated kitchen that is filled with high-end culinary purchases like a Vitamix blender, Le Creuset cookware, and bakeware. On the side of his enormous stainless steel refrigerator is a bookcase filled with vegetarian and vegan cookbooks. On top of the bookcase are photos of some way too happy and smiling blonde chick, probably his little sister, hanging on the ivory-painted wall. I don't enjoy being miserable, jerk, I mumble, spontaneously grabbing one of the 2 knives on the side of my plate and then stab my waffle. All around my plate are too many utensils with various functions that I could care less about. That's all supposed to be for my brunch? Why do I need 2 different spoons? What's the point of a small and big fork? A red cloth napkin? Why? And then Eric asks, and that's the owner of the apartment, are you still drunk? Taking the knife out of the waffle, I look up and point at him. I don't enjoy being miserable, I say. What is she talking about? Esperanza asks. Who said anything about that? Eric asks. What did she say? Davis asks Eric. She doesn't enjoy being miserable, he says. Well, I don't enjoy being miserable, I say. Who said you did? Davis replies. This reject sitting over there, I say, pointing to Eric. Hey, this reject let you sleep in his bed while he slept on the floor, Eric says. And then Savannah says, I mean, you hardly even know me. How can you make such an accusation? Taking a sip from his orange juice, Eric replies, it wasn't an accusation. I was merely speculating. You were beginning to get on my nerves. Sorry if I hurt your feelings, but it was just something I had to say. Savannah says, you didn't hurt my feelings, you just made me mad. My cheeks quiver a bit, but then I quickly command myself not to say. I rub my cheeks furiously. Eric says, I always make you mad, Savannah. I thought you knew that by now, he says with a smirk. Now put that butter knife down before you hurt yourself. Can I have your waffle if you're not going to eat it? Davis asks me. There's plenty of vegan ones left if you want some, Esperanza says, pointing to a plate of waffles with interesting texture and consistency. She emphasizes vegan. I pretend not to notice. How about I leave those all for you guys, Davis says, not taking his eyes away from the waffle. Shrugging, I answer, go for it. He beams with joy and then pierces my waffle with his matte silver fork. We should play in the snow after, Eric signs and says. That sounds like fun, Davis replies, a mouthful of waffle in his pie hole. Can't you eat with your mouth closed without talking, you pig? I sign and say to Davis, and Davis is deaf, so she signs. Esperanza shakes her head and then shakes her right index finger at me. You know it's not nice to insult a human being by calling them a pig. And pigs go through so much suffering just so you can get your breakfast bacon sandwich from McDonald's and then die from a heart attack. Not now, Esperanza. Seriously, I just can't listen to that right now, I fume. Esperanza shakes her head and then whispers to herself, barely loud enough for me to hear. If not now, then when? She then gives a glance to Eric, gesturing with her raised eyebrows that she is looking for his support, and Eric is vegan. He returns her glance with raised eyebrows as well and then shrugs his shoulders. Yeah, probably not the best time, but I know what you mean. You know, just because you have a million annoying vegetarian and vegan cookbooks in your kitchen and wear that stupid PETA button all the time doesn't make you some perfectly enlightened human being. A gazillion vegetarian books, but I bet you don't own even one book about racism or white privilege, I say to Eric, as well as sighing to Davis. My head begins to throb again. Ugh, why are we even having this stupid conversation about pigs? I don't really care to get into this. Anyway, savvy is just being savvy, Davis says, and signs nonchalantly. Whatever, another time, Eric repeats with a sigh. Esperanza crumples her eyebrows at me with disappointed. Well, what did she expect? I'm hungover and cranky, and she knows not to talk smack about my McDonald's. End excerpt. And then the next excerpt I want to read to you, and I'll analyze it after. Actually, I'll analyze what happened just right now. So, what's happening now is that I'm kind of using, Eric's obsession with always wearing PETA buttons and talking about veganism and how he thinks he is this symbol of white civility. So, I eat this way, and he's always making fun of Savannah. I can't believe you eat like that when they go to McDonald's. I can't believe you eat like that. Not really fully aware of why Savannah, who's very poor, may eat at McDonald's and may not shop at Whole Foods like he does, but shops at Walmart. So there's constant reminder with the food objects in place while Savannah is eating at his apartment, the class difference, but also the meaning that Eric has applied to all of these objects in his kitchen and the fact that he eats vegan and thinking that he is more ethical, he is more civilized. And the mere fact that he is so focused on PETA way of veganism really points to his oblivion around how neoliberal whiteness functions. And that comes often through the book because he just doesn't really care enough to pick up a book about racism or whiteness, but at the same time, once he learns that Savannah is lesbian and tries to help her out of the closet, you can see that lack of awareness around racism and whiteness affecting their relationship, especially when they go and eat certain foods together when she brings him to her lower class ways of eating. So my next thing I want to look at is dairy cows. So the I character again is Savannah when I read the excerpt. And Davis is her best friend, which I told you about, and his family owns a dairy farm. It's not organic, it's just a standard dairy farm. So here's the excerpt. Esperanza and I had lunch today, Davis tells me as I take a bite out of my apple. We are sitting in Violet's cafe at our usual table at the usual evening time. We drove around forever to find a restaurant that serves vegan food and fair trade teas and coffee, he said. Why the hell is she a vegan now? I roll my eyes. Remembering how 2 years ago she had decided to turn into a vegetarian and drove her mama crazy. She had been given a PETA pamphlet by some crazy white protester at a KFC in Willimantic. She and I had been walking by it to get to the fabric store. This short and fat white lady was screaming, "Animals are the new slaves!" I told Esperanza not to take the pamphlet, but she did anyway. For 2 weeks straight, she would not stop telling me how cows were enslaved, just like black people had been. There was even one point in which she threatened to end our friendship if I didn't stop eating chicken McNuggets. I told her literally to kiss my black ass. She didn't talk to me for 2 weeks. Davis says, it's her new thing. I mean, I get that her dad was murdered because of coffee and cocoa, but now she wants to stop drinking milk and eating eggs because she says it's all the same thing. I told her that she didn't know what she was talking about and that all our cows are treated really well and humanely. Oh Lord, I'm not interested in going through this crap with her again, I say. I don't know, maybe it won't be as bad as it was last time, Davis says. We found a place called Veg Planet and all I was allowed to eat was a fermented tofu burger called Tiki or Temple or something weird on gluten-free bread. I don't get it, whatever, I guess it's her new thing. Her new thing, I ask? Yeah, some new natural diet based on compassionate consumption. We had some nasty brownie, he air quotes the brownie, made from rice milk and carob and some other nasty crap. Her face looks really cleared up from acne though, and she claims it's the vegan way. He emphasizes his pronunciation of vegan way as if it is some esoteric, mysterious path to enlightenment. I giggle. I remember when Mama tried to convince me that carob was just as good as chocolate, I say, shaking my head as I try to get the memory of that blasphemous taste out of my mind. When she realized that I was lactose intolerant and some lady at school found out, she gave Mom some carob and soy powder and promised her that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and chocolate milk. Did it work? Hell no. She ended up mixing Hershey's cocoa and Domino's sugar to get me to drink soy milk during my childhood. She thought it was cheaper to make it from powder than to buy packaged soy chocolate milk all the time, end quote. So what's going on here? I'll give my best shot. So here's my analysis. So throughout the book, and not just here, but throughout the book, Davis tells Esperanza, that she doesn't know what she's talking about, but he also tells Savannah she doesn't know what she's talking about in terms of racism. So, he's telling Esperanza, you don't really know what's going on with the cows. Our cows are treated humanely. And then Savannah speaks about lactose intolerance as well. So cow milk's normalcy, like the norm that we have in American mainstream culture, represents white supremacy as well as speciesism and how humans can determine what is humane for non-human animals, just like white people like Davis can determine what is racist and angry black female militant banter and what is not. So what Esperanza says is probably uncomfortable for Savannah and maybe too close to home. Both black human slaves and cows' reproductive systems were and are colonized and exploited to feed certain human beings. Esperanza is alluding to how black female slaves' children were taken away from them while they were still expected to lactate and nurse nurse white slave masters' babies. Similarly, the only way that dairy cows can produce milk for humans is to be constantly impregnated, and their babies usually are taken away from them immediately from the grieving cow mom. Now, with this scene about dairy, my intention was to have dairy as a food object become a symbol of interlocking oppression that narrates multiple histories of racialized and specious oppression of people and non-human animals as quote-unquote commodities within a white supremacist capitalist logic. Savannah's cultural foods, and she's Seminole and has ancestry from slaves that had been, people who had been enslaved and brought over from Africa. Her cultural foods are not cow dairy, along with 85% of the black population of the USA who are severely lactose intolerant. So with this scene, I want to ask, what has occurred in which her cultural foods were replaced with the expectation that she can drink readily available cow dairy in a nation in which, like I said, 85% of the black people are lactose intolerant? How did the institution of antebellum slavery and the industrialization of the food system through Euro-Anglo-centric racist and capitalist logic create a situation, a dietary situation, in which Savannah has found herself first drinking cow milk and then finding out that she's lactose intolerant? And looking beyond the food objects of cow dairy, what stories do other commodities such as Coca-Cola, Cocoa, McDonald's, and Domino sugar tell us? How does Esperanza's character look at these food objects through a decolonial lens? So just to back up, like throughout the book, Davis, like I said, he mocks what Esperanza says about the treatment of animals, but he also kind of mocks Savannah whenever she talks about her real experiences with racism and whiteness. And he's always there white-splaining everything about animals and about how racism really functions. Does that make sense? So I'm using that excerpt about cow dairy as well as other instances in the book where I talk about his family owning a dairy farm and how his family is like one of the first people to have immigrated from England to Connecticut to settle that town. Of course, there were indigenous people there at the moment, right? So just really looking at that whole history where they come over with their new ways of doing things, and you see 300 years later, he's still very much convinced that he knows what's right for non-human animals such as the cows that his family owns and exploits, as well as people of color, what they say was what is racism and what isn't. And to note, I also construct Davis as a different type of white. So whiteness is not a monolith, but it's also, you know, pretty much influenced by many factors, especially socioeconomic class and region. So Davis always tries to distance himself from being like Eric, who's this, you know, white upper middle class guy who went to Harvard, who spent time in the metropolitan area. So Davis is kind of proud to say, like, I'm this guy who grew up in redneck Connecticut raising cows, so I'm a different type of white. I'm not like that type of white yuppie that Eric is. And he holds very strongly to his beliefs about the dairy farming and whatnot. So I want to kind of move in next into Esperanza's character and how she actually looks at food objects through a decolonial lens, while characters such as Eric look at food objects through a neoliberal whiteness lens. And take a look at Coca-Cola and how I use Coca-Cola in the book. So Coca-Cola's powerful influence in Savannah's life throughout the book is quite significant. There is a scene in which Savannah and her mother are at the dinner table and Savannah drinks her Coke. It ends up being so sweet for her that it causes pain in one of her unfilled cavities. Simultaneously, Savannah found online that Coca-Cola offers a scholarship to college students, and Savannah really wants to apply. So Coca-Cola is actually a marker of the industrialized food system and modernity. So whenever nations who never had Coca-Cola finally get Coca-Cola, it says a lot, and it's quite disturbing because Coca-Cola, you know, they mark this, their products mark this modernity, but it's also a marker of extreme capitalism, human rights violations, and water privatization, to name a few. So the soda that Savannah is consuming is destroying her dental health. but her highly stressful life and socioeconomic class make her and so many others in her situation easy prey to foodstuffs that deteriorate bodily health as well as overall community health. And I think this is important to note because I started looking at these objects of post-empire whiteness and how it differs for someone like Eric versus Savannah. So she knows it's hurting her body, but at the same time, that's what she's used to, that's what she's used to reaching for. So Coca-Cola, it's hurting so many communities, but especially the most vulnerable, communities of color and poor communities. At the same time, her teeth, her body's literally deteriorating because she continues to eat this way. Coca-Cola, as well as products like Domino Sugar, Hershey's Cocoa, products that actually have been extracted through exploited human labor. And a lot of sugar comes from using bone char from non-human animals. So there's just like a lot going on here. But the difference between she and Eric is that Eric has the voting rights with his money, his economic power to go to Whole Foods, to go and just buy certain things like a Vitamix blender to make everything from scratch. Just those markers of, like, once again, I'm the more civilized human being because I'm eating these food objects. While he's there to tell Savannah that what she's doing is not ethical. But he does it through a lens where he doesn't understand how lack of access to what would be considered healthier foods to help her body is determined by legacies of colonialism and slavery and what is currently seen as environmental racism and the mere fact that she's growing up in a home of a single black mom and what she makes a comparison to what Eric's family had made is very different, and it's because of race and class discrimination in policy. So it's just like, that's how I'm using these objects to start explaining food is not just this mundane object, but it can really tell you a lot about the current state of race and class in the USA and beyond. So I focus a lot on chocolate and cocoa in the book as well. And I want to read 2 excerpts which have to do with Eric and Esperanza and Savannah finally going to New York City where she had never been to the village. And there's a scene where they're in a club and Eric has ordered a drink. It's a chocolate martini and it really upsets Savannah. It's not very crowded, I noticed, looking around. About 10 other patrons are scattered around the floor. We don't open for another 15 minutes, but y'all know Chinua, and he's super special because he's best friends with Cesar. Drinks? The waitress asks. So what do you think so far? Troy asks, several minutes later. I'm sorry, that's not right. So what do you think so far? Eric asks several minutes later, sipping a chocolate martini that, for some reason, costs $15. I roll my eyes. A $15 martini, Eric? Well, I offered you one since it was above your budget, but you said no, he says to me. It's not above my budget. I said I didn't want one because that's obnoxious, I say. He decides to ignore me and then repeats the question to Esperanza. So, what do you think? And Esperanza says, obnoxious isn't really the word I'd use as much as oblivious to how many people have probably died to get that chocolate into your glass. Eric shakes his head. Huh? No, I mean, what do you think of the club so far? Oh, you meant that, she says, shaking her head, pretending it was an innocent miscommunication. I'm so loving it. And then the next one is more about chocolate martini. So they're done with going to the club, and then they're outside, and they've decided that they're going to go see the Broadway show Annie. And just before they go, Savannah asks to borrow a cell phone so she can call in on her mom because her mom has emphysema, and she's just really worried about her mom because she knows while she's away, her mom is sneaking in cigarettes. So Eric's about to tell her what Annie's about. So she gets upset and says, I know what Annie's about, Eric. I reply with a sigh of annoyance. Chill, he replies, rolling his eyes and shaking his head. I was going to say, it's about time I see it again. Stop yelling at me all the time. Why do you always have to be so mean to me? Eric asks. I make direct eye contact with him. Before I can yell at him again, I see in his eyes that I should stop and be the better woman. With reluctance, I tell myself to calm down and rationally explain to Captain America why I'm pissed off at this very moment. And she says, sorry, I just get upset whenever I talk to my mother, okay? And she's smoking, and she knows she shouldn't be doing that. I hear her fading away from me, and it pisses me off. I know, sweetie, I know, Esperanza says. Eric says, if you know this happens, then why don't you try to find another way to deal with it? Talk about the way you're feeling with your friends instead of barking at us, Eric suggests. Rubbing my nose and letting out a sigh. Because you do and say things that piss me off, Eric. It's not just me. Like that martini nonsense. You have no idea why it was even hurtful to me and even more to Esperanza. And then Esperanza interrupts. It's okay, Savvy. Savvy is short for Savannah. The coffee and chocolate talk can be the next lesson. There was a time when you didn't know either, she whispers. And Savannah thinks, how can she be so calm about everything he says and does? Okay, so there was a time before I met Esperanza, I didn't know that people are still dying and enslaved from my Nestle Crunch or Hershey's bar. She's right, I reluctantly think to myself. And then Eric says, kind of confused, chocolate lesson, huh? Do people of color who are brown and black call themselves chocolate and coffee? Eric asks, confused. And Savannah thinks, I probably gave her the same look too during her first November in America, when I offered to share that Hershey's chocolate bar with her during lunch, and she responded by crying about her father. Man, this is so hard. I know I'm not like him. I am not that oblivious, Savannah thinks. I like that scene, and I put that in there on purpose because I wanted to start showing that oppression and suffering are very multifaceted, that, she is so convinced, Savannah is so convinced that she is kind of innocent in all of this, and it's just kind of not her fault, and Eric is just obnoxious, he's oblivious. There's no way that, she could be just like him. And the frustration comes from, the fact that I think she kind of is starting to think about what she's doing in terms of eating and food, but the frustration comes from the fact that she doesn't have the power to change it as easily or even want to change it. So, in scars, like commodities such as cigarettes and fast food restaurants such as McDonald's, also come into play as significant creators of pain and suffering to Savannah and her mother's lives. So interestingly, when Esperanza presents veganism to Savannah, it is an offering for Savannah to extend her rather human and first world-centric view of liberation and freedom. It is actually a decolonial and anti-racist approach. Alternatively, Eric, who's also vegan, but he has the relationship to vegan food objects he consumes and how he presents it to Savannah through a neoliberal whiteness approach, indicated by his PETA bumper stickers, PETA button he's always wearing all the time, and his lack of having ever read one book about systemic racism and white privilege and how it operates. So I talked about how, food objects in Eric's life, it's just basically a marker of white neoliberal civility. His plethora of PETA paraphernalia, an overpriced vegan chocolate martini, him as a Whole Foods shopper, and always making fun of the fact that Savannah eats at McDonald's, it says a lot. And even though I didn't write the book at the time of what's happening in Baltimore, I thought it was interesting to kind of revisit this concept of Whole Foods and PETA. So this is just kind of some food for thought. So it's not till the very end where Eric actually finally realizes when he goes to Whole Foods that, wow, most of the patrons here are white, and like the people who work behind the cash register are brown and black. And once again, it's just because he never had to think deeply about this. And I've also been thinking about what happened a few days ago. Whole Foods ended up giving food to the guardsmen in Baltimore for the protests. So then there was a big deal that was made about it by a lot of vegans of color, including Sarah Woodcock of the abolitionist vegan movement. Abolitionist Society, and she wrote that, dear Whole Foods, why are you giving the guardsmen food when most of the black families who are, in Baltimore don't have access to the type of food they need? Like, what is this saying that you're actually giving food to the guardsmen? And that was a clear marker of neoliberal whiteness, where they really think what they're doing is not racist. They're just trying to help. But the mere fact that they're doing that and siding with the guards person, instead of actually being like, oh, how about we give food to the protesters? How about we give food and try to figure out ways to make it possible for people in Baltimore not to live in areas of environmental racism where they don't have what they need in terms of health, food, water, economic jobs. So I thought that was pretty amazing, and it kind of reminded me again what Whole Foods means and how it marks this era of neoliberal whiteness, and the fact that when Sarah Woodcock did kind of pin that letter to Whole Foods saying, I'm going to boycott you until you kind of change the way you are. What does it say that so many white vegans, again, just didn't get it and thought, like, why are you attacking the guardsmen? That's just their job. It's just that. And this understanding that it's a whole system. It's a system. So when you say that you're not going to join the Black Lives Matter movement, you're not going to join what the Baltimore protesters are doing because you think it's political, but then you help the guardsmen with food, that actually says you've chosen sides. When that had happened, when I had read about that, and Whole Foods just kind of had me thinking again about the character Eric and his oblivion to his collusion with neoliberal whiteness. As much as he thinks he's this great guy who's trying to help this black poor lesbian come out the closet, just his relationship with food objects, the way he talks about Whole Foods and only noticing now who can afford to shop there, it just says a lot. And Mark Lombardo, he's the author of Economies of Whiteness on the Social Ecology of White Liberals. He writes throughout his book how particular food objects amongst neoliberal whites convey that they are a different type of white, which I think was interesting. So they're not the poor, quote-unquote, redneck whites, and they're not the wealthy, elite white Republicans. They are the whites who voted Obama into office, who helped support Bill Clinton's policies, such as NAFTA and the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, that had very racist and racialized consequences. It's obvious that, like I said, PETA and Eric's veganism come from these post-racial centers. And like I said, I did this on purpose also to kind of echo the dissertation work I had done on vegan cruelty-free shopping guides, and really focusing on PETA founder Ingrid Newkirk's post-racial vegan logic, where when they had a campaign showing animals being killed for food, and had positioned it next to black men who had been lynched, and not understanding why the NAACP was so pissed off about that. And her response was, we're all animals, so get over it. So, she's just kind of functioning in that post-racial world, and it's hurtful to actually be in a relationship with somebody who has that framework where she literally thinks she isn't racist, or she's not colluding with racism, and colluding when PETA advocate all of these cruelty-free food objects that are put together by huge corporations that actually exploit humans, and like tomatoes, they're picked by mistreated brown women, indigenous women, in Mexico. Just the way the farm workers are treated. Like, no, when you look at PETA's site, they never look at anything past was an animal harm. They never look at the farm workers' rights. They never look at how racism plays into how the food gets to people. And for the most part, we see that a lot in the way Eric looks at his food objects, but we also kind of see that with Savannah. And it's not necessarily the same thing, and I'll talk about that in a second. So Esperanza's character engages in veganism from a critical race perspective, particularly when she tries to make connections to cow dairy and the exploited reproductive gifts of black women during anti-Pilgrim slavery. And we see Savannah finally opening up to veganism when Esperanza teaches her that Cesar Chavez was vegan because he saw the same intersectional oppression occurring with Latino immigrant farm workers and the treatment of farm animals as part of the hierarchy. That is, understanding that racism, sexism, xenophobia, and speciesism, as well as other isms, are part of the matrix of domination and oppression. Like I said, while Eric comes off as thinking of himself as civilized by drinking vegan chocolate martinis that are not, fair trade, Savannah struggles with not being interpreted as the same as Eric in terms of oblivion to oppression in food objects. And it's Savannah's sight of struggle with these food objects that shows the damage that neoliberal whiteness and globalized capitalism have on the mental and physical health communities of racial minorities such as Black Americans in the USA. So Esperanza's relationship with food objects and her decolonial approach intervene for both Eric and Savannah to produce better ways of thinking about ethics, race, whiteness, and the food commodity chain. So if you're interested in more of how food objects, veganism, and critical race and materialism are recipes for racial tension headaches. I invite you to check out my work, and most recently my online conference that happened a few weeks ago. We recorded everything. It was called The Vegan Praxis of Black Lives Matter. I'm not sure what happened to my keynote presentation, but okay. So I want to show that information. There you go. Okay, so this was it, and it was recorded. But my questions were, what does ethical consumption look like in an era of Ferguson? Could it be a continuum of Black Lives Matter movement and resist neoliberal whiteness and systemic racism? What would it look like if we made visible to mainstream vegan USA that the murders of Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, Michael Brown, Oscar Grant, and Eric Garner, to name a few, are the collateral damages of neoliberal whiteness? And here is how you can follow my work. And here's information about my books and my dissertation. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask me. This is very new for me. I've been talking about Sister Vegan for 10 years, it seems, and I'm really trying to focus now on scars. It's a little challenging for me right now, trying to just how to figure out how to parse it all together. So this is like maybe only the second time I've actually talked about this, but it will become more and more refined, hopefully, and make a little more sense as I extract more excerpts to read to make those connections in terms of food studies and critical race materialism. Thank you.
How long have you been a vegan, and did you ever have a weight issue in your life that you had to contend with? And has veganism impacted that in a positive way?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So I've been vegan since 2004, with the exception, which I tell everyone, was my first pregnancy, where I freaked out and became not very confident and had a few eggs per month. And then I went back to being vegan in 2009. So the weight thing is interesting to me because I'm actually really annoyed that people propose veganism, at least the mainstream sizes, fat shaming culture proposes veganism as a way to lose weight. Like, it drives me nuts. It just drives me nuts. It's just stupid, and for the most part, I think that the size or the body of somebody has nothing to really, it's not connected to your health. And it's also very cultural. And I actually, when I went vegan, I went holistic vegan, which means I ate a lot of greens. I still do high fiber foods. I ended up losing weight, but in all honesty, I've never really been a larger person past a BMI of like 20. When I lost the weight, my parents freaked out because Black women have curves, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to us Black women talking about how our families just were not supportive when we did end up losing quite a bit of weight when we did choose to practice veganism. And then others talked about how they did not lose weight and some of their family members made fun of them. But overall, there was this consensus where we didn't feel supported. So my dad still tells me, you look really bad, you need to gain a good 20 to 30 pounds. He always says that, always says that. He just doesn't think I look quote unquote beautiful, but he and my mother are used to this culture of beauty being thick women, and that's just how it is. And I have this story where I visited Dartmouth College. We had a, I don't know, 5 or 10 year anniversary, I can't remember. And one of the, there were like 5 Black women and 1 Black man that came back. And the Black women were like, give this girl something to eat. Give this girl something to eat. And my white colleagues were like, you look good, Bree. So it was just like, it was interesting. I never will forget that. But for the most part, I personally struggle with gaining weight. And that's because I've been nursing nonstop for 6 years. And like when they're 2 years old and sucking 1,000 calories out of you a day, it's just hard. But I know it's weird for me to say this, but I'm self-conscious because my parents keep on telling me how bad I look. They don't say bad, but how unhealthy I look, because my mom's like, when I told her I'm going to wear a strapless for my wedding, she's like, no one wants to see your bony collarbone, like stuff like that. I mean, I laugh it off now and we talk. I'm very open to my parents. When they piss me off, I tell them. When I piss them off, they tell me. So that's kind of my experience. And yeah, just trying to deal with that. But I also know I have sizes and thin body privilege. And people ask me all the time, what do you do to be skinny? And I want to know, and was it veganism? And I answer that this is not what the Sister Vegan Project's about. It's about being critical and about understanding why you got to the point where you're asking me how you can be really skinny. And people don't necessarily want to hear that, but people contact me and ask me, can you put me on a diet so I can lose weight? And I'm like, but did you not read the goals of the Sister Vegan Project? So, but it shows how there's mostly women who contact me saying that they're not happy with their body and they want to try veganism to lose weight. So that was a good question. Thank you. Yes?
I had a question about Esperanza, which does she identify as black as well?
She identifies as mixed, but she does consider herself like Afro-Latina.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think that that's like a really, because what I was worried about when hearing about the character was that I wasn't sure if he did,
Mm-hmm.
because there's anti-blackness in every culture, and I was worried. I think it's good that the room heard that, because I think a lot of POCs are groups like, oh, they're all people of color.
Yeah.
So then and the views are like picked through to what makes white people comfortable. And I think it's good to like know that that was an Afro-Latina, so that it wasn't like a non-black POC, like tone policing
Yeah.
of black women.
Yeah. So her father's Nigerian and her mother was Guatemalan, or is Guatemalan. Her father died, and she acknowledges, that she's Afro-Latina. And there's like a lot of lack of acknowledgement that Latin America actually has African roots and people, and if you're brown, you probably got African in you. So I know that whole like conversation where it's just the new scholarship, at least in academia, showing that yes, there is colorism in Latin America, and there's because of anti-blackness and stuff, and it's not being named in a lot of countries, but people are more or less writing more about it. So I want to make that obvious in my own writing too, that she is identifying as Afro-Latina, and that she totally pulls from both her Nigerian and Guatemalan background. Thanks. Oh, yes.
I was just wondering, so it seems like a lot of people nowadays, they introduce veganism usually in terms of like the health benefits and losing weight and that sort of thing. And it also seems like veganism has been gaining ground, but it hasn't really been gaining ground in this sort of like intersectional sense at all.
Oh, yeah.
So do you think that this sort of focus on like, just talking to other vegans that are activists even, that are really interested in this, a lot of times they say like, well, we talk to them about health first because that is automatically people are interested. And then, maybe we'll get to the other stuff. They'll eventually start thinking about cruelty, and maybe they'll eventually start thinking about these other political issues. Like, do you think that's like a valid tactic for, I guess, promoting intersectionality in veganism, or promoting veganism as this thing other than this health beneficial thing?
Well, I think we live in a country, whether you're going vegan or eating local animals, that everything is so one-dimensional. So I see the problem in not just veganism, but everything that's part of the mainstream. And we'll just talk about eating local animals because we'll talk about one issue. We'll talk about the health benefits. And I think a part of that problem comes from, like I said, we're in a society, but most of us have been trained to be single issue and not think intersectionally. So with me, as a strategy, understanding that when I first was looking at veganism, I would use different strategies for primarily Black women-identified population, and looking more at health disparities and the history of slavery and colonialism on womb health, and the fact that so many people with wombs who identify as Black have tumors that are apparently connected to not just food but environment. So I really looked at that because it seemed like that's what got me into veganism. The Afrocentric vegan approach using Queen Afua, who once I was diagnosed with tumors, I was thinking, oh, she does Kemetic veganism? What the hell is that? There's a way outside of whiteness to do veganism. So I realized that using the approach, not necessarily health, but going in with a decolonial critical race lens, even if you're talking about health, it seems to really help, at least when I was looking at Black women, when I was first interested in the Assisted Vegan Project. Overall, unless people are ready for thinking intersectionally, whether it's veganism or not, I still have a challenge. I got lots of people he didn't understand why would I have a vegan praxis of Black Lives Matter. Black omnivores didn't get it, white vegans didn't get it. I got just a lot of emails indicating that they just still didn't have that critical literacy around intersectional thinking. But I think it does seem to work when I first introduce just the single issue, and then I slowly branch out to making the connections, and making the connections in a way that connects, I'm repeating the word, connects to the what is important to that particular culture at the time. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but okay, good. Yes?
What do you believed is at the core of all oppression?
I don't know. I change all the time. I want to say capitalism. At least I started looking more into like Black Marxism and just kind of revisiting capitalism. So I feel like capitalism is a core problem, and that capitalism needs racism and sexism and exploitation of animals to, like, that's kind of the center. So it's hard for me to talk about that because I haven't actually written much or researched more about it because I'm so focused on critical race theory. But I feel like capitalism just seems to be a problem. Like when you commodify anything, even if you're making cruelty-free commodities, once you commodify something within the logic of capitalism, capitalism by default can never create equality. It can never create alleviation of oppression because the logic of capitalism is to exploit. So even ethical consumption that follows capitalism, it's like you'll see that it doesn't even out. So I feel like I need to focus more on the capitalism aspect and how capitalism is used, and how racism and neoliberal whiteness kind of all come together. So that's my answer for this week, but I often change. Yes?
With that being said, have you studied like veganism practices outside of capitalist economies?
Not yet. I mean, like the closest is like the interpretation of people from the 20th century, like Queen Afua, who talk about comedic veganism from 2,000 years ago. But still, she's doing it through a lens of, you know, industrialized capitalist world. So I looked at that, and it looked interesting, but also she seemed to kind of repeat a lot of the themes of oppression anyway in her work. But I haven't really looked too much into anything else, or like histories, because a lot of the history is, people write history through their 20th or 21st century conditioning. So I haven't actually been able to find or search too much yet what veganism can look like out of a capitalistic logic. Like, and I'm still decolonizing my brain. Like I'm still trying to figure out what everything looks like without capitalism. I mean, there's I can't remember his name. Is it Robert Wolff, Richard Wolff? I can't remember, but he's amazing. He does alternative economies, and he really looks at Marxism, and his work is amazing. So I've been trying to listen to a lot of what he says. He's in KPFA, and he talks about alternatives to capitalism in a way that I never really thought of, because like my brain is still, it's been, as Angela Davis would say, it's just been colonized by capitalism. So that's a good question. Yes?
Could you explain, or maybe re-explain, sorry if I didn't understand, your opinion on the comparison of black slavery and animal slavery?
Yeah, I actually don't like comparison. I like intersectional approaches. So I think it's dangerous to do comparisons of suffering versus seeing how they all are gears in a matrix of oppression. So it's not like, I mean, I don't have a problem if people start talking about it intersectionally, but when like people like PETA use it, yet they're still very racist and sexist in the way they organize, and then I have a problem with it, because like they're exploiting the suffering of people of color without even taking care of their in-house issues of racism and white privilege. Does that make sense? And then with, you know, Esperanza, with her character, I mean, she's not really making a comparison as much as she's making those intersectional connections and trying to understand, you know, how is it the logic of taking a non-human animal baby away from their mom? How does that work, you know, when we look at the gears of the matrix of oppression in terms of what happened during antebellum slavery? So I'm more of I don't like comparison, I like intersectional approaches. So that's kind of my belief is if you can work on that to understand, that's not comparison, but there's more or less there like functioning of those gears. I think that actually probably is more culturally appropriate, and I guess it gives people a way to see how unique speciesism is and how unique racism is and antebellum slavery is, but still can see how they all kind of uphold each other. I don't know if that helps, but it's hard. I mean, it's hard to do that, but I tried to do that with Esperanza's character. So, and Savannah being really upset by that, it's just like it really hits. It's hard to kind of think about. You're taught. What do you mean? Like I'm suffering from racism. I'm suffering from the legacies of antebellum slavery, and now you're suggesting
this thing that I've been doing, you know, I thought I was a good person, and I'm not oblivious like white Eric. So I kind of put that in there, that conversation about cows and his comparison versus intersectionality, so she can start thinking about that in her role, and try to reevaluate what she thinks liberation is. She doesn't necessarily have to become vegan, but to really reevaluate what those gears look like in the matrix of oppression. Yes.
I was curious on one of the slides you were comparing individual actions like around boycotts and things that can take up so much energy that don't leave much space for structural change. And the slide mentioned food deserts.
How was that? Was it this one? I think. Oh, right here. The end change can only come through individual consumer power.
Yeah, and it had something about food deserts. Anyway, but I'm wondering if you also think about bank deserts in the same kind of way.
Bake?
No, bank, B-A-N-K.
Bake. Like financial institutions.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think about everything the same way. Like so there's food deserts, but I don't know much about financial institutions. I think about educational institutions. I think about other stores.
The reason I ask is a lot of times areas in the community where there's a food desert are also areas where there's no bank, so people have no option to do anything but go to a payday loan store.
Oh, okay, that's what you mean. Yes, I
and so
understand.
they're really screwed over.
Yeah.
It's another predatory. It's just another predatory form. And I thought, well, I was kind of looking. I thought, well, where's that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, so I can't put like I
No,
can
I
give you a whole
understand,
list,
but-
but yeah, I was, and then a lot of them are next to jails, right? So so you can't bail out your loved one unless you
You
go
can
and do
often
that.
tell what's going on in the community by where the payday loan stores are.
Yeah. So, but that's another thing. And there's there's a scene in the book where you briefly meet a character whose father had been killed by the police by mistake because they thought he was just some other black guy that was a criminal, and just the amount of suffering that this character goes through because his father had been killed, and giving that kind of background of racial profiling. And yeah, see, we're not in a post-racial era, and that takes place in a little small private health food store where this young black man who has physical disabilities is trying to raise money for his Paralympic team, Special Olympic team. And it's actually from a real person I actually met when I was living in Cambridge, when he had approached my husband and I, and he had told us what had happened and how he has physical and mental disabilities, and he had gotten a C and a D in his community college, and because he didn't keep up a C, he had been kicked out, and then he owed thousands of dollars. And it was so unfair on so many levels. And I'll never forget, just like my husband just broke down and cried. My husband's a white German, neoliberal whiteness being affecting him at the time, not really understanding how deep it goes, and not really understanding why you hardly see black people in these situations in a healthy private store. And why when you see him, he's coming and asking patrons for money so he can raise for his powerlifting team. So, and that story I put in the book because I thought it was like really powerful and important to kind of remind you, well, yeah, you're in the store with all of these possibilities to vote with your dollar, but look what's happening to this young black man and what happened to his father, and how he's being punished. So I don't know if that helps, but like kind of looking at like what happens with racial profiling and the mass incarceration of black and brown people. Regardless of that, he's in the store where it's healthy food. So, yeah. Yes, the black hat.
We talked about intersectionality and so forth, and not necessarily putting various types of oppression into a hierarchy or anything, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts about a sequence of those or kind of causes, because one thing I've thought about is as infants, while we're learning the sounds that farm animals make, we're being fed pureed farm animals, and we don't even know that yet, that that's what we're eating. And then we learn that, and like, I think at first it's probably horrifying, but then it becomes normal.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that then begins to drive we have to other those animals in order to be able to live with ourselves, and then does that feed like sexist behavior, racist behavior, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it depends what your cultural upbringing is, what struggles each household has. So, I mean, I think I was more acutely aware of issues with racial power dynamics before I was aware of what I was eating. And that's because I was like black in all white rural New England. Good job, Mom and Dad, for raising me there. So that's what I kind of thought about. But I've met people where white, middle class, where they didn't have to worry about socioeconomic class, they didn't have to worry about racism. So a lot of them came to that point where they first were introduced to speciesism, and then from there, they start making the connections. So I think there isn't really a hierarchy that works for everybody. I think, like, once again, for me, the racism part, that was where I started with. And then from there, I was able to then start making those connections much later in life in terms of eating non-human animals. But like other people, I've met something, there's people who are living with physical disabilities, and they talk about how living with disabilities really shifted how they didn't want to consume animals anymore. So I so now we're at Sunny Taylor, her work. She talks a lot about her consciousness around how disabled farm animals are treated, and then talking about how humans who are disabled are treated. And really understanding how that was integral to her moving to see more of the intersectional approaches to oppression. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think there is a like cookie cutter way to approach it. It's very unique and situational. Thanks. Yeah.
I have a question about what your thoughts are on how neoliberal whiteness is internalized by people of color. For example, we have a lot of these organizations popping up who want to boycott places like Chipotle, things like that,
Yeah.
where a lot of people of color might eat because of class economics or class standing. And a lot of these organizations are either founded by or they target people of color, vegans of color for support. And then vegans of color go into these places and you're eating meat, you're participating in oppression, XYZ, without addressing the fact that for a lot of people of color who are not vegan, sometimes this is the only way they can get a meal, a decent meal, or take the kids out for a nice meal or something like that. So what are your thoughts on combating that, and just in general about neoliberal whiteness being internalized by people of color?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I see that happening all the time, but the consequences are different on people of color versus white neoliberals. So I'm kind of thinking more, I don't know if I can directly answer the question, but I'm going to backtrack to the work I did when I was looking at Afrocentric veganism in Queen Afua, and her really pushing decolonial veganism in the way that she thinks is right, and like reclaiming black community, black health. And the way she does it actually, it's anti-racist, but at the same time it reinforces all these other isms that I see as part of neoliberal whiteness. So there's a lot of ableism in that rhetoric. There's a lot of, not very supportive of lower class people, more of like this middle class sensibility of what black civility should be. There's tons of transphobia, and there's the assumption that a black woman is partnered with a cisgender black man. So I see that as like I always say, the collateral damages of neoliberal whiteness on people of color. Then I see that creating even more problems because there isn't that intersectional approach or reflection on how, well, yes, even you who are doing Afrocentric veganism and thinking it's decolonial, you're still reinforcing these isms that you see and how neoliberal whiteness is framed. To answer your question about the restaurants, I think that's just hard. As someone who didn't actually grow up in a situation where I only had access to what would be considered fast food chains, I don't know. But I think there's, like, what bothers me a lot is the lack of understanding that everyone is suffering, including the animals and the humans that work there. Like, restaurant workers' rights are horrible in this country, absolutely horrible. And there's a book called Behind the Kitchen Door, and it's like the further you go back in the kitchen, the darker the staff become and the less well-treated they are. So, there's a lot of people who, they're all about a vegan restaurant, but they don't care about the human beings that are being exploited.
and they just don't understand or care enough to look into that. And then with, once again, if you don't have the choice to eat certain ways because of how things are organized in your neighborhood along the lines of class and race, it's really hard to make those options. But I know a lot of people are doing that, like Oakland. I mean, I'm right next door to Oakland. There's so much food justice work that focuses on environmental racism, the prison industrial complex, what would be considered food deserts, or having what would be considered limited options. So there's a lot of work doing that and looking at alternative ways of addressing that without making the people of color and poor people there feel bad about the choices that they're making. So I think when you make someone feel bad without understanding the context and understanding history, then you're just like, the strategy is going to fail. Like it's incredibly cruel. And I always think that if we can just start treating human beings in a loving, ahimsa way, then I'm wondering if then from there, well, other things like the mistreatment of non-human animals, environmental degradation, will then that come from it? Is the problem just like the way human beings treat each other? Like I always struggle with that. And then from there, well, does that, when you create a human being that way, then will they be more likely to do the intersectional approach to alleviating oppression across the board? I just don't know. So, but it's getting a little late, and maybe I could answer one more question. Yes?
Maybe this will end it on a hopeful note, but it's so hard for a lot of people to avoid monopolized corporate produce. And I'm wondering if there's a story that you'd like to share with us where you think it's community has really successfully bucked against that, and something if there's anything you'd like to share with us.
Yeah. There's a lot of that work going on in the San Francisco Bay Area. Giltrack Farm, which UC Cal has been trying to take over forever. They claim that they own the land, but there's a bunch of people that have been doing community garden work there, and they're trying to bring some grocery chain there that no one needs because they're growing their own food. So they've been fighting against it, and they've tried to bulldoze it, but then the people came back and regrew. So it's a positive story, but at the same time it's like enraging because it doesn't make any sense, but then within a capitalist logic, yeah, it does. And then there's I think it's Africa Town in Oakland, where they're just really, this landlord didn't do anything with that lot forever, didn't care, and then the community came and started making their own food, growing their own food. And what does the landlord do? Comments and say, no, you can't do this, every time. So I began to think about a lot of what the Black Panthers did, and what they did really pissed off the government when they started looking into food sovereignty. A lot of people in the mainstream are taught different story about what the Black Panther Party was really about, but like the government really got concerned when Black people figured out how to feed themselves and not rely on corporate capitalist entities. And there's like this story where the Black Panthers were trying to put together the food programs for the kids in the morning, and I think one of the CIA or FBI white guy agents broke into that cafeteria and pissed all over all that food for the kids. Like how enraged he was about that. Just like I'll never forget that story. Like these people can feed themselves. Like the people, when you give them back their land, they can feed themselves. That's like so dangerous. So I feel like there's a lot of good stuff happening, at least in the Bay Area, but there's also a lot of scary things because, yes, 200 people can come together and fight and hold off, but these corporations can easily just have the National Guard come in or whatever entity, military, police, violence, just come in and easily just wipe everybody out, And that's kind of what's scary. Sorry, but that's kind of what's scary. It feels like at times what people are doing, it's so small, and how you fight up against that violence, And then when you fight against it when someone's trying to hurt you, how you get in trouble because you just want your own food sovereignty. So there's a huge shift, and we see that with, Baltimore and Detroit. That's all about the loss of land of Black folk. And then you have to understand the history, the Great Black Migration to North, where all of the land that they had in the South, and then everything, the SHIT hit the fan with Jim Crow. So let's just get out of there and go to the industrialized North. And that was a loss of land. There was a loss of so much. And there's a lot of Black people, communities of color, trying to reclaim land and growing food for themselves and understanding the power of food sovereignty. But it's difficult because you've got the corporations who are in bed with government agencies that can just go in and hey, just send off the National Guard, send off police and destroy them. And that's kind of the frustrating part. But I feel like people are doing this work the food sovereignty work, especially for people of color, because they know it's the right thing to do regardless of the result. And that's how I try to function. Like, I do it because it's the right thing regardless of the result. So it's inspiring, and with social media, those of us who have access to that and seeing what's going on, for people who are sight abled, and I like it. It's impressive to me. It's impressive, just the mobilization, and there's a lot of people who don't support it. You know, neoliberal white people saying like this is stupid. Why are people just like fighting this while black people just go and work hard? You know, and there's like tons of people who are supporting it and see and are comprehend and are making those intersectional connections. That, oh wow, what's happening in terms of black people who've lost their land? Like, this is connected to what I've benefited from as a person who is white and, you know, a neoliberal white person. So there's people who are beginning to understand that and see that, comprehend that the collateral damages are also not just on people of color and food, but also on like white liberal America. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I want to answer it. So we're done, and I record all my talks. So if there's anything you missed, check my blog out, and I'll upload that, and I can. I usually have that up within like 36 to 48 hours. I'm still trying to figure out the closed caption aspect of YouTube. It doesn't understand things like neoliberal whiteness, so we'll just like put something else there. So yeah. Okay.